Once again, if you'd open your Bibles to Mark chapter 13, you might want to pull out your sermon note sheets to follow along as well. An open Bible, pen in your hand, sermon notes. We've been looking at the last week of the life of Christ, and called the Passion Week, from the time he came into the city of Jerusalem to the time he is crucified, buried, and resurrected. And we saw that it was on a Sunday that he went into Jerusalem, and now we are in Tuesday. We're bringing Tuesday evening to a close. The setting is that Jesus is with his disciples. They're coming out of the temple, and they're going to go over to the Mount of Olives. It was while he was in the temple that he was questioned by the religious authorities concerning his own authority, civil responsibility, his view on the resurrection, what he thought was the most important commandment, and finally about his own personal identity. And as they're coming out of the temple, one of the disciples stopped and said something to Jesus about how big and how glorious and how magnificent the temple was there in Jerusalem. That brings us to verse 1, where we read, "Then he went out of the temple, and one of his disciples said to him, 'Teacher, see what manner of stones and what buildings are here.'" Jewish historian Josephus wrote that there was nothing like it in the whole world. Begun by Herod in 20 BC, the temple was later completed by Herod's descendants sometime before AD 66. Its beautiful white marble stones with gold ornamentation reached 100 feet in height. Surrounding it were colonnaded walkways, courtyards, and stairways that filled 20 acres of the most prominent landscape in all Jerusalem. Look at verse 2. "And Jesus answered and said to him, 'Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone shall be left upon another that shall not be thrown down.'" It's in verse 2 that Jesus responds to this disciple who said, "Lord, look at the magnificence of these buildings here." And Jesus responded by saying that one day, yes, all these buildings will be brought down. Not one stone will be left upon another. Dr. Warren Wiersbe has stated that the Jews defiled the temple, that Jesus departed from the temple, and that the Romans destroyed the temple. In verse 3 we read, "And as he sat on the Mount of Olives opposite the temple, Peter, James, John, and Andrew asked him privately." Do you know, they came out of the temple area, they went down into the Kindred Valley, then they walked up to the side of the Mount of Olives and they sat down. And 4 disciples came to Jesus to privately question him. They were at 2,600 feet, 200 feet higher than the Temple Mount area. So they had a 200 feet elevation looking down on all of the structure of the temple and the temple grounds. And Jesus says, look at verse 4. Or they say to him, "Tell us, when will these things be, and what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled?" So they're asking Jesus 2 questions. When will these things be? And secondly, what will be the sign when all these things will be fulfilled? And if you go over to a parallel passage in Matthew chapter 24 and verse 3, it reads, "And what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age?" So they're asking really 3 questions. What will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Well, the disciples weren't just satisfied that this building, the temple, is going to come down and one stone will not be left upon another. They wanted to know the ins and the outs of everything that was going to be happening. And Jesus is going to talk to them about the future destruction of the temple. But along with that, there is prophetic implication of the coming of a great and terrible day known as the Tribulation period. That's Revelation chapter 6 through 19. The destruction of the temple was only foreshadowing a greater destruction to come. And that is during the tribulation period. It wasn't uncommon in prophetic literature to predict one thing with implications about another. And that's what we see here in Mark chapter 13. Now there's three divisions I want to give you from Mark 13. First of all, it's almost like Mark 13 is like an earthquake. And what you have are the early warning signs. What I call the tremors in verses 5 through 13. They're just a tremor. You know something, I've been in my office when they had an earthquake in Seattle. And I knew that there was an earthquake somewhere because as I sat in my seat, all of a sudden I felt like I was spinning like this. Have any of you been in an earthquake? You know what I'm talking about, right? You just there's this internal spinning that goes on inside of you. And then I remember being at my house the night that Southern Idaho had an earthquake, and it was like a freight train coming through my house. So I know there's a tremor. And then in verses 14 through 23, there's the great tribulation we call the shaking. There's going to be this mighty shaking that occurs in the end times. And then finally in verses 24 through 37, there's the second coming. That's Revelation chapter 19. That's the aftermath of all the tribulation that takes place here on earth. And so my desire today is that we have an understanding of verses 5 through 13, making sense of the tribulation. I want to help us to understand the timetable of God's prophetic calendar. So Mark 13, 1 through 13 is 11 early warning signs. 11 early warning signs. If you drop your eyes down to verse 8, at the end of verse 8, this is a key phrase in this passage. It's at the end of verse 8, it says, "These are the beginnings of sorrows." These are the beginnings of sorrows. Not the completion of sorrows. It is the beginning of sorrows. So they foreshadow the coming of the tribulation period in Revelation 6 through 19. Now, if you want to get a good understanding of all of this, you need to read Matthew 24 and 25, and you need to read Luke chapter 21, and then you need to read Mark chapter 13. It's also been suggested that verses 5 through 13 are the events that are going to transpire during the first 3.5 years of the tribulation period. That's why I call it the early warning signs. So what are the 11 signs that are going to take place? First of all, deception. Look, if you would, at verse 5. Jesus answering them. He's answering their questions. And he began to say, "Take heed that no one deceives you." Underline the words "take heed." That is used 3 times in Mark chapter 13. It is used in verse 5, it is used in verse 23, and it's used again in verse 33. So as you're traveling through this, Jesus is saying, don't be deceived. Know that these are a prelude to a greater prelude to come. And, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to know that we are living in a day and age of deception. People are being deceived all the time. Deception is like a fungus. It just keeps growing. Okay? And the events that transpire in the first 3.5 years, there's going to be a lot of deception that is going on during that period of time. I want to point out something in verse 5, though. It's the very last word. It is the word "you." Notice that Jesus says, "Take heed that no one deceives you." We read past this sometimes. Jesus is talking to his disciples here, and he is. But the Bible wasn't written just for the disciples back then. We have the Word of God for us today. And we need to be careful that we are not deceived. Okay? What's the second sign? Look at verse 6. "For many will come in my name, saying that I am he, and will deceive many." There will be people who will come on the scene who claim to be the Christ. My first church I pastored was in Nemo, South Dakota, 25 miles from Rapid City. And one day I was driving into Rapid City, and there were some electrical poles on the alongside of the road, and I saw this white sign in black letters, and it said, "The Christ is now here." So I pulled over to the side of the road, walked over to this power pole, and I pulled the sign off. and I started reading the small print on the sign, and it was from the Unification Church. Sun Myung Moon, who believed that he was Jesus Christ, he was the second coming of Christ, and that he was fulfilling Jesus' unfinished mission on earth. How many of you remember the Unification Church? A few of you. And then there was Jim Jones, the founder of the People's Temple. Started off as a mainstream church, but then it went to into a cultic formality. He believed that he was the reincarnation of Jesus, Buddha, Vladimir Lenin, and Father Divine all in one person. And he allowed all of his followers to commit mass suicide. And then there's Marshall Applewhite. He posted on the internet, "I, Jesus, Son of God, acknowledge on this day, September 25th, 26, 1995, and then his followers, which were a part of what was called the Heaven's Gate religious group, committed mass suicide, believing that behind the Hale-Bopp comet, there was a spaceship that all of them, after they committed suicide, were going to be caught up into the spaceship." People believe that. And then there was Yahweh bin Yahweh. He self-proclaimed that he was God, Son of God. Yahweh bin Yahweh. God, Son of God. He was big down in the state of Florida. And then there was David Koresh. Though he never directly claimed to be Jesus, he proclaimed that he was the final prophet. The Son of God, the Lamb, in 1983. So the words there in verse 6, "I am He," some translations use the word Messiah. Beware of those who come along and call themselves the Messiah. It is the same words that Jesus uses over in the Gospel of John when Jesus says, "I am." When people come along and say, "I am," beware of them. Beware of those who claim to be the Messiah. And by the way, when I was in Jerusalem in 1994, I was standing at the Wailing Wall, the last remaining portions of the temple ground, or original temple grounds area. I turned around and I saw this huge yellow sign, probably, 300-400 yards from me. It was all in Hebrew, and I asked somebody to interpret it for me, and it said, "The Messiah is coming." The Messiah is coming. And the Jewish people are ripe for deception, because they are looking for someone who will come on the scene and say, "I am He. I am the Messiah." What's the third sign? It's wars. Look at verse 7. "And when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be troubled, for such things must happen." Notice what he says next, though. "But the end is not yet." The end is not yet. The consummation of all things is not yet. Do you know that since the time of the Jewish people, since God chose Abraham from Ur of the Chaldees, the Jewish people have faced war after war after war? And international law has reported that there's been only 268 years of peace in the last 4,000 years of human history, despite over 8,000 treaties. Only 268 years of peace. Jesus said that there would be wars and rumors of wars. Rome was a mighty military power. It was conquering. But Jesus said, even though there's wars and rumors of wars, the end is not yet. You know, we are seeing wars today, and rumors of wars that are to come. Turkey is now at war with Syria. We see parts of the Middle East under war. Africa has been at war for decades. And they will continue until the arrival of the real wars during the tribulation period. What's another sign? Look at number 4, verse 8. "And nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom." Nation against nation. You know, I have read that some time ago that 1 out of every 4 nations are at war. 1 out of every 4. Nation will rise against nation was reality during the time of Jesus. It will be a reality through our day and age. And there are 10 major wars going on today. Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Somalia, Nigeria, Southern Sudan, Ukraine, Libya, India, Pakistan. These are wars that are going on, and many of them the United States has some involvement in. Jesus told his disciples to look for these things. They're going to happen. They're going to increase. And then look at verse 8. It says, "And earthquakes in various places." Earthquakes would also be a sign that we are living in the end times. I have a list in your sermon notes since 2009 all the way to the present. And there were 3 years in which we've had, in 2011, there were 15,798 earthquakes around the world. And then in 2014, 15,121. And then in 2015, 14,795 earthquakes. We're talking about an earthquake here in Mark chapter 13. On January 13, 2010, Haiti had a 7.0 magnitude quake, devastated the city of Port-au-Prince, killing 316,000 people. 80,000 buildings in Port-au-Prince and surrounding areas collapsed. That's not even talking about all the things that they've faced recently with hurricanes. In March 11, 2011, Japan faced a 9.0 magnitude earthquake and a tsunami that destroyed Japan's northeast, leaving ruins. 15,690 people were killed, 4,740 were missing, and 5,710 were injured. It threw the third largest economy in the world into recession and triggered the world's biggest nuclear disaster since Chernobyl in 1986. So there's going to be earthquakes. And Jesus said that would come. What about the sixth sign? Look at verse 8. He goes on to say, "And there will be famines and troubles." Famines and worldwide famines are a result of nation rising against nation. It's a result of lack of rain or even flooding. Today there are 800 million people who suffer from chronic undernutrition. In underdeveloping countries, 13 million children under the age of 5 die every year from malnutrition. You know, famine isn't always caused by drought. Many times famine is caused by political unrest. A lot of times it's caused by discrimination. It's governments holding food back from certain groups of people because they don't agree with their politics or their religion or their ethnicity. You know, I remember in the news in Rwanda, when Rwanda was going through all of its civil unrest, that 1 million people died and 5 million people were displaced. When Bosnia was in the news so long ago, 3 million people were at risk of hunger. In our own Western Hemisphere, Haiti, the people of Haiti right now have the lowest life expectancy. The highest infant mortality rate in the Western Hemisphere is in the country of Haiti. And I want you to see how verse 8 concludes. Jesus said, "These are the beginnings of sorrows." Circle the word sorrows. Do you know that word in the Greek carries the idea of birth pains? Now, I just went through that with my daughter. You know, she went in with she started having these little small contractions, and then they built and built and built and built. I don't know anything about it. But you women do. Jesus is saying the signs around us are going to start really small and they're going to grow. It's the beginning of sorrows. Look at verse 9. We see number 7, the seventh sign. "But watch out for yourselves, for they will deliver you up to councils, and you will be beaten in the synagogues. You will be brought before rulers and kings for my name's sake, and for a testimony to them. Jesus is talking to Christians. He's talking to the people of the way. They're going to be delivered up to councils. They're going to be taken into synagogues, and they're going to be beaten. They're going to be brought before rulers and kings. Now, a part of that occurred in 70 A.D. But you know, before the destruction of Jerusalem, that the emperor of Rome sent his army into Jerusalem in 66 A.D. and slaughtered 3,500 Jewish people. Killed them. And that caused the Jewish people to revolt, to rebel. And then it was in 70 A.D. when they came in to destroy the city of Jerusalem. And the last Jewish people to stand against Rome were the Jews that fled to Masada. And the Roman armies built their encampments around the base of the Mount Masada. And they waited out the Jewish people up on the mountain. And when they finally broke through, they found out over 1,000 Jewish people committed suicide. And the Roman army had no victory. No victory. We're talking about the first 3.5 years of the tribulation, in which people who are saved during that period of time will be persecuted. Look at verse 10, sign number 8. And the gospel must first be preached to all the nations. Well, that didn't take place before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 A.D. That's an early warning sign that the gospel is going to be preached to the ends of the earth. As a matter of fact, in Matthew chapter 24, verse 14, Jesus said, "And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached to all the world as a witness to all the nations, and then the end will come." And the gospel has been preached everywhere. You know, Warren Wiersbe said the persecution of verse 9 brought the proclamation of verse 10. And the church becomes stronger and Christians become stronger when they are persecuted. Nobody looks forward to persecution, but the church grows through persecution. Church Father Tertullian said, "We multiply whenever we are mown down by you." The blood of Christians is seed. Is seed. And just as the gospel of Jesus Christ was supposed to be preached by His disciples, so the gospel of Jesus Christ is to be preached by us. The command that He gave to His disciples in Matthew 28 is our command. It is called the Great Commission. We're to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy, teaching them to observe all things that are commanded. And lo, I'm with you always, even to the end of the age. You know, I was reading a book called Serving as Senders. It had a chart that said during the early church period around AD 100, there was one church for every 12 unreached people groups. One church for every 12 unreached people groups. In other words, each congregation would have had to target 12 cultures in order to even begin to disciple the nations. Today, the numbers are more encouraging. For each remaining unreached people groups, there are 583 Bible-believing congregations, averaging 80 members per church. Can you think of the possibility if 583 churches came together to be accountable for just one unreached people group? We could reach the world today. If 583 churches that had 80 members apiece would come together and target just one unreached people group, it is possible that the gospel will be preached to every nation. Do you know, I've also read that it's been reported that there are enough resources in America alone to accomplish the task. Only 1% of new believers would be needed. Only 1% of new believers would be needed, and only 1% of the annual disposable income of churches, and only 2% of the time for prayer that most Christians spend watching TV would be needed. We could reach the world with 1% of new Christians, 1% of the disposable income of the church, and 2% of Christians praying. The gospel could be preached to the whole world. And then, what's sign number 9? Look at verse 11. "And when they arrest you and deliver you up, Do not worry beforehand or premeditate what you will speak, but whatever is given you in that hour, speak that. For it is not you who speak, but the Holy Spirit. There's going to be imprisonment. Imprisonment. You know that all of the disciples except John died martyrs' deaths. Do you know, in the last year, 245 million Christians were living in places of high persecution. 4,305 were killed for their faith. 1,807 churches were attacked. And 3,105 are held in prison today. Over 3,100 Christians are in prison today somewhere around the world. During the tribulation period, the church has been raptured. The gospel is still being preached during the tribulation. People are going to respond. They're going to make a decision for Christ, and they're going to be persecuted, and they're going to be imprisoned. Let's look at number 10, verse 12. Now brother will betray brother to death, and a father his child, and children will rise up against parents and cause them to be put to death. Is blood thicker than water? Not so in verse 12. Not so prior to the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem, and not so during that first 3.5-year period of the tribulation. You will have mothers and brothers and fathers and sisters and siblings all betraying each other. I just can't imagine how a father could betray a child, or how a child could betray a parent. And if you've ever seen the movie A Thief in the Night, you know that the church has been raptured, and the government, the Antichrist government, has been set up on earth. People have to receive a mark of the beast in order to buy or sell or trade. And because there are family members that do not want to receive the mark of the beast, other family members are turning them in to the local officials. They're being betrayed. And during this period of time, people will say, who can I trust? And the answer is no one. You won't be able to trust anyone. And finally, what's the 11th sign? Look at verse 13. And you will be hated by all for my name's sake, but he who endures to the end shall be saved. Hatred. Christians who are unashamed of Jesus will be hated for his name's sake. And over in John chapter 15, Jesus said, if the world hates you, be of good cheer, because it hated me before it hated you. You know, the promise there at the end of this verse is that he who endures to the end shall be saved. The Greek word there is hupomio, and it means to remain under. To remain under. But he who remains under, he who stays steadfast to the end, will be saved. There are some who are thinking about, well, is this being saved from the tribulation, or is this being saved for salvation? You know, as we walk through these 11 early warning signs, my intent wasn't to scare people. I don't want to scare you into making a decision for Christ. But I want you to be aware of what's going to take place. The future does not necessarily look like a bed of roses. It's not going to be a field of wildflowers. It's going to be a terrible, terrible time. And then remember that Jesus is talking about the destruction of the temple. But he's also giving the implications of what's going to take place during the tribulation period. And there are people here today in this service, you can miss the coming tribulation if you will take heed to the words of Jesus today. But if you refuse to heed the words of Jesus today, you will face the terrible future that awaits us. So what can Christians do? First of all, we can witness for Jesus Christ, knowing what life will be like during the tribulation period. I'd encourage us to share our faith. You know, I remember being at a Bible study one night and somebody said, do you think Christians really believe in hell? I said, I think so. And he said, I don't think they do. And I said, well, why? He said, because if we really believed that there was a hell to come, we would never shut up about sharing Jesus with people. We just never shut up. We'd be sharing Jesus with everybody if we really believed there was a hell to come. Do we really believe that there's a tribulation to come?
Yeah.
Do we want to see our family go through that?
Yeah.
No. And then we can know what we're talking about as Christians. We need to have a good handle on this book. We need to study the prophetic prophecies that are found in the Bible. When the topic comes up, we need to know how to answer people. Because there's a wide variety and a wide gamut of ideas that people believe. And we need to piece the Bible together, rightly dividing the word of truth. And then finally, we can trust the Holy Spirit to use us to share His word with people. So there's three things. Share your faith. Speak what you know. God's plans. And trust the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Amen.